Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony O'Brien. I'm the copyright advisor here at the University of Newcastle. I'm joined today by my two colleagues, Jenny Schoolander and Nicole Gammy, who are research liaison librarians and currently waving at you if you can't see them. So this is part of the Researcher and HDR Student Workshops webinar series. And today we're doing Getting Copyright Right in Your Research. And I have right in the inverted commas because, you know, there are levels to this. So today we're going to focus on 3 different sections, and we'll each be presenting a different section. So we'll be looking at ownership, requirements, and also the outputs themselves. But before we go any further in, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So the University of Newcastle acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands within our footprint areas, and that's the Awabakal, Darkinjung, Biripi, Worimi, Wonnarua, and Eora nations. And we feel it's important to pay respect to the lands that we're on. We also pay respect to the wisdom of the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend this acknowledgement and pay respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphones muted. We will stop every so often for some questions, but you can also add them into the chat. So yes, whichever way you feel more comfortable, if you want to pop them in the chat, we'll read them out for the benefit of the recording, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly, that's fine too. So this session is being recorded. We record all of our webinar sessions and we add them up onto YouTube, and everybody that registered for the session will be receiving a link, plus some of the key links that we'll be talking about in the session today. So as I mentioned, this one is Getting Copyright Right in Your Research. Next week on the 1st of September, on the Thursday, we're doing presentations and papers and posters, oh my, which is a reference to Wizard of Oz for those that don't know. And that's going to be specifically focused on copyright considerations for conferences, because we like our alliteration. So if you are from a school that is really interested in presentation, I should say conferences and symposiums, please check out the live session next week, or check out the recording that'll be on YouTube if you're watching that from the YouTube recording. And then closer to Open Access Week, so the week before Open Access Week, which will be Thursday the 13th of October, we're doing a special session around data, so open data, managing data, data mining and copyright, all that kind of stuff. And we're calling it Data Do, Not Data Don't. Again, just because we like our alliteration. So those are the 3 copyright and licensing open access type workshops that we're doing as part of this current series. And we also have a whole heap of stuff up on our YouTube channel already from webinars we did in semester 1, and we'll be making references to those as we go. So I'm going to hand over to Jenny now, who's going to talk about the ownership section with you.
Thanks, Anthony. Hello to everybody joining us and watching after the event. It's great that you've been able to join us today, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some really nice information about copyright within a research kind of field. So in our digital age, we're both users and creators, and copyright laws help balance the rights and the responsibilities of both the users and the creators. So that means there's 2 sides to any copyright protections. How will others use your research, and how will you be using the research of others? So there's all kinds of considerations that need to go into that. So reusing copyright material in your research will need the clearance from the copyright owner, and others using your research should also be asking you for permission before using any content that's owned by you. And there's a variety of ways to seek that permission. That includes forms on publisher database, direct contact, etc. This also includes any content that's being used in theses. So if you're doing your PhD at the moment, or you're a supervisor, it's important that you know that there's all kinds of copyright limitations that are going to be associated with any content that's being used. So the moment that an idea or a creative concept is documented on paper or electronically, it's automatically protected by copyright in Australia. And some of that's going to be covered a little bit later by Nicole and Anthony. But as you can see from this slide, generally the creator of a work owns the copyright, but there are some exceptions, and we'll be covering that a little bit later. That work must be sufficiently original or is original in its content to be copyrighted. And as I said before, there's no formal registration process in Australia for something to be copyrighted. There are differing rules in different countries, so you will need to be considering that if you're collaborating across continents. Also, an important thing to remember is that copyright can be transferred, sold, or leased. So there's a whole lot of ins and outs and roundabouts that go with copyright, and hopefully some of those conundrums may be answered today. Thanks, Anthony. So the other thing to be aware of is that institutional policies will influence copyright ownership. We have an IP policy at UON where creators retain ownership of any of those works that are created, and unless, as that last line says, unless the uni has funded that creation. So broadly speaking, as an employee of the University of Newcastle, the university will own the copyright when something like course material is created as part of your regular duties. But then scholarly and creative works that are part of your research, they can generally be owned by the author or the creator. As I say, there's some bits and pieces that make it all very confusing, but as we go through today, hopefully that is going to be clarified a little bit. Now, if you're working across institutions, collaborating with other researchers, some of those copyright ownership laws, details are going to vary. So, as I said, if you're working across institutions, you need to be double checking with any of the institutional policies that are related to your collaborators. You would want to be making sure that you're determining who's going to be the owner of that copyright as you're working through research. The creator of that copyright material is not always the copyright owner. So it just seems to go around like a philosophical argument, doesn't it? You're not quite sure who owns what. So it's important to have it documented and agreed on before, in writing as you're going. Sometimes a formal agreement can be made about who's going to own the copyright of work that's going to be created. So there's an example that keeps coming up in things that I've been looking at. So if you're a songwriter, you can make an agreement with a music publisher, and that music publisher becomes the owner of the copyright, but an agreed percentage of any income coming from those songs will be given to you, the songwriter. So, copyright, as stated in that previous slide, can be transferred or sold to someone else. Under copyright, as it says in the middle there, essentially that ownership will be equally shared across multiple authors. There's no sort of designation of the first author has more rights than the second author, etc. It's equally joined. So if two or more authors have contributed to a work that's inseparable, which is pretty much what happens when you're doing research, or it can't be seen as interdependent, then they're joint owners of the copyright. But again, a formal agreement can be entered into to recognise ownership by all those parties, but that's not a strict requirement either. Any author can also then sign off on research where any author ownership is retained. Thanks, Anthony. Now, just following on from that, if you are considering working across institutions, or you're affiliated with some other institution. Like the examples here, we've got you know, the University of Newcastle, or Hunter New England Health, or HMRI, or any other institution. You've also got to be taking into consideration how that affiliation might affect some of the open access agreements that the universities entered into when it comes to publishing. So this is sitting a little bit outside copyright, but it's something to be aware of as well when you are working in a collaborative or affiliated environment. Think of how all of these kinds of co-authorships are going to affect a few different areas of your research, getting it published, copyright agreements, publishing agreements, and we have strict sort of guidelines when it comes to who is going to be able to access things like the article processing charge funds, who is being noted as the first author, etc. Okay, thanks, Anthony. So right at the beginning of any partnership or agreement or a collaboration, make sure that you do have that agreement in place as to who is going to own the copyright. Is it going to be just one person? Is there joint ownership? How is it being owned? It is important to have that documented somewhere. That could also relate to if you're working with an outside organisation, such as a local council, and you're making some kind of video or podcast or something. Whilst you're having the discussions initially with that organisation, make sure you understand who it is that's going to own copyright, how you would like any copyright in the future to be used, and all those sorts of things. Make sure that it's noted that you're going to be credited with any of the copyright information. You know, you're the creator of something. Make sure you're being properly attributed. It's not going to be changed in any way. What kind of reuse rights are you going to put in place as far as copyright goes? And then that last line, reach out to Key. So Key is the knowledge exchange and enterprise group that's part of the university, and they're part of research and innovation. So again, it's just all about making it clear who owns the rights to any of the content in the works that you're creating. Thanks, Anthony. So reusing copyright material in your research will need clearance from the copyright owners, but the same happens in reverse. Anybody reusing any of your content is going to need to make sure they get in contact with you. There's various ways to get that permission. You can also make sure that the rights to any reproduction or adaptation of your work gets permission, but also if you're reproducing or adapting something that belongs to someone else, make sure you get permission from the copyright owner. A performance that we've got noted there, that can be any kind of public display of your work, and can include things like performing a play, reading from a literary work, playing any recorded music that you may have created, showing all or part of a film. So that's what performance means. And again, works both ways, either you as the owner or you contacting the owner. Publication is all about making copies of a work available to the public. Have you got permission to do that? Has the other person got permission from you to do that? Communication incorporates things like broadcasting or emailing or making something available on a website. One of the things that I looked at also includes faxing. I don't know how many of us still fax anything, but it's included in there as well. You're communicating something to the general public. And the moral rights, everybody that creates something has moral rights to their work. So always make sure that you're getting the correct attribution as the creator of something. So that's all I've got to say. Are there any questions on that so far? No?
No
All
questions
right.
yet.
I'll hand over to Anthony and he can go with the next lot.
Great.
Thank you.
Just before I kick into my slides, just a little note on the moral rights there that Jenny was talking about. They don't actually exist in every country. For example, in the US, moral rights are actually quite limited in scope, and it's usually for visual art and stuff like that. So we're actually quite lucky here in Australia that moral rights were written into Section 9 of our Copyright Act, because it means that you as Australian researchers have that, I guess, legislative backing behind you, so that if you do find that you haven't been attributed properly, or you've been falsely attributed to, you know, a version of your work that you don't want to be, that you can actually take legal action because of that part of the Copyright Act. So it's an interesting part of it. And the other thing too is that you can also, if you are working in a teaching space, you can basically say to your students, like, oh, if you don't do referencing, you know, you can get in trouble under the law because it's written into the Copyright Act. So that's why Australian universities push so much for referencing, because it's tied directly to the Copyright Act. So I'm going to talk about the requirements section. So there's lots of different things where copyright will pop up as a requirement in different things. And the first that you're likely to encounter, even perhaps before you start your research, is part of your funding agreement. So funding is a very key aspect to research, obviously. You know, if you don't have the money to do the research, it's very hard to do it sometimes. So it's important that you have a look at any funding agreement that you're either interested in or signed yourself up to, because they often have requirements around open access, around who owns material, things like that. So always double check what's in your funding agreement before you sign it. Or if you've already signed something, go back through with a fine-tooth comb, and you can reach out for support to the three of us here, and we can assist with this if you have trouble understanding the legalese. So specifically around open access, quite often there's a time period that is specified for when you need to make your research output available. They're usually reasonably open, like when the final version is made available in a journal, for example, if you're looking at a journal article or a conference paper, something along those lines. Usually there's a requirement within, you know, a couple of months of it actually being made live online with the publisher. They may also have requirements around how you make it available. So in addition to it being made available through the publisher, they may expect you to make an author manuscript version available online yourself. And you may also need to attach an open license to it. Just to give you an example there, so the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia there, NHMRC, they have it written into their funding agreements that you have to make an author manuscript available under a Creative Commons license. So for those that haven't come across them before, Creative Commons is one of the better known open licenses. So they bake in permissions for users to use the content in a certain way. So instead of having to reach out and ask for permission, you may have already granted them permission to make an adaptation or to be able to use something for non-commercial purposes. So that license that you can see there, that's the CC BY 4.0. That's known as the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. So all Creative Commons licenses allow for certain usages, but you have to provide attribution. And again, that ties back into things like moral rights. So that's the most open of the licenses. It allows for commercial use, it allows for adaptations, but you have to provide credits. So anyone, if you signed up to a funding agreement that has this in there, and you release an author manuscript or some other version under that license, you know that someone's going to be giving you credit if ever they use that material. And just to keep an eye out to, again, slightly outside of the copyright field, but just while we are talking about it, they may have other requirements about how you note the funding, about how you, you know, affiliate and things like that, depending on what institution you're with and which funding body you're actually getting the money from. So it's always a key thing, read any agreements that you sign. So Jenny touched on this a little bit in her introduction, but third, I just realized that says third copyright material. That should say third party copyright material. So I'll be fixing that slide up. So third-party material is anything that's owned by somebody else. And you might think, well, hey, I wrote it, I own it. It's important to realize that once you sign up with a publisher or something like that, you could actually be transferring your copyright away. So even though you created something, you may no longer technically own it under copyright. So third party is material is anything that's owned by anybody else, including potentially material you've created yourself. And one of the key things to remember, and again, Jenny touched on this a little bit in her introduction, is that once material takes some kind of concrete form, so a recording, some kind of electronic thing, digital, or just even being written down, it takes on that copyright status. And most material that you'll come across will be copyrighted in one form or another. So it's important to understand that, going to the third point there, that just because something is online and freely available, that it doesn't actually mean it's not in copyright. So there's a big confusion between this idea of public domain. There's the kind of general usage of the words being publicly available, but public domain has a very concrete meaning when it comes to copyright, and it means it's actually out of copyright. So just because something is publicly available on, say, a government site doesn't mean that there's no copyright associated with it. So there's the confusion between something being free and something actually being, out of copyright. And key point there is number 2, anytime that you use somebody else's material, you need to make sure that you get that permission to be able to reuse it, because if you don't get permission, you're basically infringing and you're breaking the law. Fun. So it's very easy to get, or I shouldn't say that, it's usually very easy to get research-related copyright permissions. So things from journal articles and conference papers, all that kind of stuff. Normally where it's through some kind of database or online platform, there'll be an online form. You can fill out your details very, very quickly. A lot of the big publishers use the Copyright Clearance Center, which is a US organization, the CCC. And once you go through from the abstract site, you'll get that online form, fill it out. Usually you then have to register with the CCC, and you pretty much, in many cases, will get permission like that. And I don't know if that actually picked up the snap on the microphone, but I made a snap noise with my fingers. There we go. So I did touch on Creative Commons a little bit earlier. So these are great, and going back to Jenny's point, they work with both sides of that copyright coin. So they allow you to bake in the license yourself and put it out there to the end user how you want to allow them to reuse your material. But they also allow you as a researcher to make reuse of other people's material very, very easily. So as I've already mentioned, at an absolute minimum, they're going to require that you do that attribution to say where you got it from. There's usually a particular way of doing this. And if you check out the copyright pages that we link later, I've actually got all that spelled out. And you normally need to, if you are reusing somebody else's material under an open license, you need to spell out what license it was under, so that as that information travels on, the subsequent users can see how they could potentially use that material as well. The license terms will vary though, so it's not a case of one fits all. Other than that BY attribution, there will be things like NC for non-commercial use, ND for no derivatives, so you can't adapt it or translate it or make a work that's based from it. And then there's also SA. So this means that if you do happen to make an adaptation, you need to share it under the same license as the original was. So always check those license text details. They're very, very important. If you have any questions, again, around like, I don't quite understand if what I want to do here in my research is actually allowed under this, reach out to us and we're more than happy to help. There is also a webinar, where the 3 of us looked at Creative Commons in more detail already on the YouTube channel, and I will be sending that out as part of the email with the recording. So if you're more interested in that, either reach out to us or go and check out that recording. And of course, there are lots of other licenses. I didn't realize just how many people were using paid image licenses until, kind of last 12 months. And it's like, well, do you realize there are all these free sites that have the same kind of stuff? But, if you do happen to be using Shutterstock, for example, in your research, lots of people do. They're relatively inexpensive as far as licensing images, and they have a massive bank of these things. And sometimes they have very, very particular ones that they've paid people to take for them. So yeah, Shutterstock has licensing involved, and I had a lot of questions around like, oh, I'm planning on doing this in my research. Is that actually covered under the license that I paid for? So again, we can help with that. There are lots of types of other licensing online. And again, a lot of those free image sites have some free image licensing. That makes sense, doesn't it? There's also the general public license, which is for software and other things. There's lots of material out there, which is under various kind of licenses. And again, if you have questions, reach out. And then there's the old school way where you actually just reach out to the copyright owner and get that permission directly. And I've assisted people do that with things like, you know, architectural plans and things like that they've wanted to use. But can't stress this enough. Reuse terms will vary. So just because you're able to do something under one license or one particular copyright owner gave you one level of permission doesn't mean it's across the board going to be the same. So always double check what's in the permission or license text and make sure you follow it exactly. Because if you don't follow that licensing text, you could actually be accidentally infringing on the content that you've bought. And Jenny mentioned theses earlier, but we like to include a quick reference to theses and dissertations as part of these webinars, just in case there are any HDR students sitting in. So there's a lot of confusion around, oh, but I put a reference in there. That covers it. It's okay, isn't it? Referencing is fine for undergraduate level assessments. That will cover them because that's part of the Copyright Act for that fair dealing for research or study. Thesis is basically like a publication. You're putting it out there online, other people are going to be getting access to it, so you need to treat the copyright as seriously as you would for something like writing a book or a journal article. And referencing, as I've got there, it only covers an insubstantial part. So insubstantial is particular wording that they use in the Copyright Act. It means a very, very small part, and it's actually much, much less than you would actually think. It's more like about 1%, if that. And things like figures, tables, graphs that you could be pulling out, they're always considered substantial. So you think, oh, it's only one figure, that's fine, that's insubstantial. It's not. They're always considered substantial, and you'll always need permission for your reuse of those things. And when it comes to actually reusing your own work, so if you've written for an article or a conference or whatever, and you want to put your paper or article into your thesis, it's usually okay. And they will allow you to put up to the entirety of your article in, but it does vary by publisher, what you need to do to get that permission and what version you're allowed to use. And by that, I mean, is it the manuscript version that maybe you got after the peer review process? Is it the version that you actually can download from the publisher database? There are all these different versions of the articles as you go through the research and publication process. And some publishers are very strict about what you can and can't use. But again, more information in our previous webinar on YouTube if you'd like to know more about that. So I'm going to hand over to Nicole now, who's going to talk about the outputs side of things.
Terrific. But please, if you've got any questions, you're welcome to add them to the chat for us. We'd love to hear some of your thoughts at the end of this. So thank you, Anthony. So as Anthony mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit about the journal publishing. So one of the, I guess, the slight downsides when you publish in a journal is that often you're transferring at least a proportion of your copyright as part of the publishing agreement. But you do maintain certain rights. The big thing to do, a couple of things. If you don't understand what you're signing up for, please ask before you sign. It does create some challenges, but there are some options there. So the rights will vary by publisher. So check the publishing agreement. Again, if you're not certain, please let us know. The last point on that slide is the difference between paywall and open access, and APCs are part of that, or article processing charges. So basically the difference between a paywall and open access is in some aspects they're pretty well nearly the same, because someone's got to pay for something. It's just who's going to pay for it. So in terms of, are we talking about the user's going to pay for it, or is it the author? With a paywall subscription, so something that's behind a paywall, you need a login to get into it. So such as a lot of the databases that the university library has provided for you. The library or the institution pays for you to get access to that. On the open access side of things are freely available, but as an author, you're the one who pays the money for it to be published. So it does have its advantages, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a sec. The open access, just to mention that before I do move on, is often at a journal level. It's not necessarily at a sort of a publisher level. It often comes down to individual journals. And also within those journals, that can be mixed availability. It's not guaranteed just because it's open access that everything, all the content in one journal is open access. So do look at that sort of thing before you actually understand what you're signing up for. So at the university level, which has actually happened at a much higher level to start with, actually, CALL, which is a group of university librarians in Australia, has negotiated with some of the publishers for these read and publish agreements, or what we call transformative agreements. We're hoping we can change the publishing model so that things become more freely available. It is a slow process, and we're starting to see some of the action happen here in Australia. Some of the overseas, it's a little bit further advanced. So what we're aiming to do is move content from the paywall, so i.e. the university having to pay, to open access. So by providing, but we're still remunerating the publisher, so we're still paying the publisher to do some of those sorts of works. With those, we have negotiated a number of them, and they're available on the library website for you to view. So you're welcome to please have a look at that. So Anthony's now showing you the page, which will put a link into the recording for you in terms of the email that gets sent out afterwards, so that you can actually have a look at this. What you'll notice is at the bottom, sometimes it can be, depending on which way you want to look at it, if you know a particular journal that you want to publish in and you know who the publisher is, then you can go in through the individual publisher through one of those links. But if you're not too sure and you're just going fishing to see what options are out there, then there's a combined list at the bottom that can be sorted on discipline areas, and you can go in and have a look at what's available in terms of that. With these ones, we basically, they're being paid for, so it's free publishing. So please take that up. On the other side is the option here to, we have some discounts. So there's some journals listed on the left-hand side, but you might be looking at one of the other publishers where we have, that we don't have a transformative agreement for at the moment, but they offer a discount. So please, before you just submit to a publisher for things, check to see if you can't get a few dollars off, because 20% if you're paying $4,000 or $5,000 to get your article published, it's a little bit of a saving. So you've got to help yourself a little bit in relation to that. The big thing to remember about some of these is that on the page here is our current 2022 offerings. Some of these are for longer term. Some of them we've got a 3-year agreement currently, but it is an ongoing process. And interestingly enough, we've just heard in the last couple of days that there'll be some changes next year to the Wiley subscription here. They're actually going to add some more journals to that for us, so there'll be potentially more options under that. So watch this space, and we'll let you know when things are available that way. Alrighty,
normally it stays in the presentation mode, but there we go.
So in terms of thinking about some considerations around open access, it's fabulous in that sort of sense. It does help improve your citation rates, because the big thing too, especially for some disciplines, or really it applies to more than it doesn't, is that it gives access to those people in developing countries and other places that may not have access to some of these really, really expensive databases to get this information out. So that's going to share your research with a wider audience and potentially then build on it, or there's collaboration opportunities that might come out of it. You don't know until things go out there. The other thing too is, as mentioned on the second point on that slide, is it can be part of a funding agreement requirement. So you need to put your items out there. The other thing too, but what you need to think about in putting your stuff out there, as I've described it, is what version of publication is allowed. So there's 2 differences here that we've mentioned. One is an author manuscript, and the other one is a version of record. Okay, so what's the difference? So an author is the last version, an author manuscript is the last version before it gets all those pretty things that the publisher does to it. Okay, so the version of record is the publisher, is the PDF that comes out of the database. So with some things like such as, for example, you could deposit your, if it's a journal article or something along those lines, you could deposit an author manuscript into Nova without breaking copyright. But you couldn't put the PDF, the publisher's PDF into Nova. I suspect you wouldn't get past the, can I please add this? And you would get quietly told that, can you please provide another version that we can actually upload? So do think about that. The big thing and the safer option, as mentioned in terms of posting, is into Nova. The biggest challenge with ResearchGate is that if it's you may end up getting a notice if you've put the wrong version up that things need to be removed. And we've had a few notices from academics in the last few months about ResearchGate sending people a copyright claim. And there's something on the university, on the library latest page about basically explaining the breaches in that may have happened. So it's just a case of not saying you can't, you just need to be very careful about what you what version that you put up with onto these sites. So best to go with Nova, and then you know that everything's okay from that side.
Oh, Nicole, did you just want to explain what Nova is, just in case people aren't aware?
Yes, no problem. Nova is the university open access repository. So, and it's not just journal articles that you can put into Nova, and not just theses either. So you can also put in data sets, any kind of your research outputs can go into Nova. So please consider that as an option to put your stuff into. The nice thing about Nova is that you get a permanent place of that you can refer to. So if you're doing any publicity around your work, then if you put it into Nova, you can go, hey, I can write this in Twitter 140 characters later and go, but have a look for more information here, and you can provide a link to a Nova record where it comes. The other thing that might come up too in relation to that is an embargo period for posting. What we mean by that is simply where we might put a record up, such as in Nova, and then, but we don't want to put the actual item up yet because you may wish to publish some content somewhere and you can't, and the publisher won't let you put content up in Nova just yet, the actual physical content, not just the record, for a period of time. And those embargoes, depending on what it is, and the publisher and the discipline, can vary anywhere between 12 and 24 months. So it might just be that from that perspective. So what we can do though is put up a full record, so which will have, as part of that, has a summary. So it doesn't give away the total story, it just gives people an idea as to what's there. So please do consider that, and don't let things like embargoes put you off submitting your stuff to Nova or from that perspective. Okay, so moving on in terms of, which kind of alluded to, there is some support to getting in terms of from a publishing perspective. I would like to preface this by saying the research liaison librarians, of which myself and Jenny are two, we have two other counterparts who basically deal with the medical science aspect of the job, can help you here in terms of finding funding options, finding options for journals, but also can help you to make sure that you meet the criteria for the APC fund. It is pretty strict, so best to go fishing first before you put an application in and find that a simple check would have saved you wasting your time applying for something that you won't be able to get, won't be able to access. I've already mentioned that there's other discounts, and the read and publish agreements are there as well. So please look into all your options, and we're happy to provide you with some support that way. Another thing to think about too is that you might want to keep more reuse rights. So there's nothing to say that you can't investigate on the Spark Author Addendum website what other options that you may be able to get. So things like if you want to publish in a repository, so in terms of signing a copyright away, they might be a little bit reluctant to do some of this sort of stuff. So you can actually ask them to make sure that that you can do that. Also, if you want to add it to a course site, so if you're teaching it, you're using your research as part of your teaching as well, something to think about on that front. And it's easier to have than not, because if you don't have it and you look to try and do something, you may not be able to if you signed your copyright away. The other thing too is that we have a webinar on this. It's the Know Your Rights webinar on YouTube. So if you would like some more information, it goes through and explains how you apply for the Spark Author Rights Addendum and gives you a little bit more information. Terrific. And the next bit I'd like to have a bit of a chat about is research data. So what we're talking about here is, and when we're talking data, we're talking the broad spectrum of data, not just numbers. It might be interview transcripts, it could be design stuff, it could be a whole range of things. Think about whether the data from your research might be useful for others. Could someone else value add to your stuff? Could it offer a collaboration opportunity? So there's lots of potential there to keep in mind as you're working your way through. Also, as part of your, and I've heard it from a number of academics, you may be required to make your data accessible as part of a funding agreement. One way to do that is you could put it into Nova, which will then make that available. You also might need to check to make sure they don't want it put in a specific repository somewhere. Yep, so do check your funding agreements in that. Also, you'll need to think about how you'll manage and share your data. So if some of this sort of stuff sounds like some bits that you might need to know a little bit more about, come and join us on the 13th of October and we can have a good time with talking about data and all those ins and outs and bits and pieces about that. So the last thing I wanted to cover this afternoon is the non-traditional research outputs, the stuff I spend a good bit of time, yes, hearing all about, and it's absolutely amazing. So basically what we're talking about here is pretty well, one easy way to define it to a large degree is anything besides a journal article. So I'm just thinking, because usually the traditional stuff is easy to get metrics on. I like all the stuff that's not that easy to get metrics on, the good fun bits and pieces. So this might be, and it's not limited to, things like creative writing, those reports that you might get commissioned to or you get asked by the government or another group to actually do. Making a video, you know, websites, coding, podcasts, you know, the list goes on and on and on. So please, I mean, they're part of the research outputs, but they're something that we do need to consider. So a couple of things here is, do they stand alone or are they part of another output? So an example of that is you put together an exhibition, you've developed, say, a new technique in an artistic endeavour. And so what you may end up doing is that you display your final pieces or piece, depending on what you've done, but you might also do a methods paper to go with that to explain what you've done and what you found. Another example could be that you've got that display going up and you watch and you take a video of someone actually seeing the display installed as part of your stuff. So what you need to think about there is the ownership where you've got collaborative works, especially when you've got different elements. I mean, it's nice when it's clear cut that someone's done this and someone's done that, but often the world's a bit more murky than that. So please make sure that you identify things, as Jenny mentioned earlier, and to make sure that everyone who should be getting recognition does actually get that. So another thing to consider with these, and certainly with the non-traditional stuff, is the use of third-party materials. So things like you might get inspired by an image and the whole journey starts with just seeing something and you just go, I've got to have a look at that. I've got to investigate. I've got to sort of work things out and see where I can take this. So the big thing with the third party material, especially when it ends up in being as part of the published as a part of the non-traditional research outputs, is who owns it. If it's not owned by you, please make sure that you check the license, and you may need to get some permissions from that. The other thing to think about too is how to represent the non-traditional research output, or the NTRO, and the ownership / copyright in these representations. So who's actually going to get what? So a couple of examples. So for example, if you, as an artist, you put an exhibition up and someone comes in to take photos, the person who actually took the photo owns the copyright of those photographs. If you want a copy of those photographs, you can potentially get hold of that by negotiating with the person who's taken the photos to sign their copyright over. But again, it's not an automatic thing. Another one that's a little bit interesting too is when you put like if you're this way inclined, you get asked to put a statue, to develop a statue that ends up in public. In that sense, people can take photos of it and that sort of thing. In that case, you retain the moral rights to the statue, but anyone can take a photo of it. So it's an interesting things that you need to think about in relation to this sort of the non-traditional stuff. So please, if you do have any questions about this in relation to copyright or what might happen or anything else, please reach out and let us know, and we can investigate if we're not too sure of what the answer to the question is. So that brings us to the end of our session this afternoon. So I'll hand over to Anthony, who'll wrap things up. And just to give you the heads up, Anthony, I've got a question for you.
Oh, good. Okay, so yes, as the black slide says, we do provide support for copyright. Yay! So please don't bash your head against a wall. If you have questions around copyright, open access licensing, you can reach out to us. Some open access stuff we may refer you to the repository staff, just because that might be more their ballpark, depending on what we're doing. But there is actually a quick address there you can use. This is just a quick URL that I've had set up. It's newcastle.edu.au/copyright-request. It will take you through to this lovely form where you can provide details of your question, give us any links or anything else. If you desperately need it done straight away, you can change the priority, you can attach any files, and you can give us your contact information there. We also have a great website, which I'm currently in the process of updating. So you may have noticed some things have changed recently. Just going back to the using third-party materials that we've touched on a lot, if there's a lot of stuff that you'd like to check out, including some of those free image sites and things that I mentioned, they're all under this open license and free resources there. So there's video, images, all kinds of stuff in there. So check that out. If you're working in teaching spaces, various copyright notices and things are there. And also for how to properly, I should say, attribute any open license material you're using is also noted in there as well. So all of that is there. And as you can see, there's a whole really long website for that, but the short one is newcastle.edu.au/copyright-support. So I have a lot of copyright-something set up type links. Does anyone have any questions apart from Nicole? Let's throw it out to the other people in the webinar first, and then we'll come back to Nicole.
No questions so far. Oh, yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Just with regard to the author manuscript deposit, some journals that I know I've published in require that we submit in a template, and then the template goes through various editing, and then obviously we send out the final product in that template. So if we were to then want to deposit that as an author manuscript, would we need to remove the material from the journal's template? Usually
that would be best practice, yes.
Yeah.
So in most cases, if the template is so close to the publisher version that there's no real way to distinguish the accepted manuscript, i.e. the version after peer review, and the actual final version. So the easiest thing to do is just copy all your stuff out, whack it into a Word document, ta-da, done.
Nice if Word worked that easily, but yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Or whatever you've got, because I know that some people use BibTeX and LaTeX and all those other things. So whatever, I guess, whatever's the easiest for you to pull it out of that that formatted template, and use it as a more kind of generic document.
Cool. Lovely. Thanks very much.
No worries.
The question in the chat, Anthony, for you is. Sorry, I can't see who it was from, but I'm a HDR student under the GADD program between UON and UPM. I'd like to ask about the patent right of my research work. In my case, the patent right of the work will be underlying for both universities. Is that correct?
Now, patents are actually outside of what we do in the copyright team. So there are lots of different forms of intellectual property, and copyright is only one of them. So there's also trademarks and patents and, growers' rights and all kinds of things. Patents are a different area. Usually, at least under the IP policy here at the university, unless the research is directly funded by the university, according to the IP policy, usually the student will own or maintain retain the rights in the IP for what they're creating. My suggestion would be to reach out to whoever is supervising you in this space first and talk to them. And then you may end up needing to speak to either the key unit in research and innovation that we mentioned earlier, or possibly even reach out to legal and see what they say. Yeah, because patents aren't really what we are able to provide advice on, I'm sorry.
To pick that up just a little bit further too, we ran a patents workshop webinar last week, so that there's also a few things that you might need to consider doing before you can apply for the patent as well, such as searching. So that might be worthwhile webinar to have a bit of a look at. My colleague Fiona went through and showed you how to search some of the databases and which ones are worth a look at. So that might something else that you might need to think about as well.
Yes, if you haven't picked up on it so far, we have lots of webinars up on our YouTube channel, so please go and check them out. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm just going to bring this up on the screen while we're here. Just as part of this webinar series, we're actually, we've got a form online and you can see the link for it there, newcastle.libwizard.com/F for form /researcher HDR. So newcastle.libwizard.com/F/researcher HDR. So there's a feedback form with just a couple of questions. It's anonymous. If you wouldn't mind going online and filling out some responses, that would be really greatly appreciated. Because it gives us an idea of, you know, if we're talking about the right stuff with you guys, if you'd like to, what you'd like to know more about, all that kind of stuff, so we can make sure that all the webinars we're delivering are actually targeted and relevant for our researcher community, or communities, plural.
Just before we do wrap up, Anthony, the question I had was about, no, that's okay, visiting people. I'm just thinking of something that came up earlier. So where does that fit in terms of some of this, the research, thinking that they might generate some material here while they're here in Australia, but then they go back overseas to their home institution. So how does that work? Is there anything different to what we've already covered this afternoon?
That's an interesting one. As far as the IP policy goes, as long as it really depends on what they're producing. If it's a scholarly work or creative work, the university doesn't take any kind of ownership in the IP, unless, of course, they're directly funding it in some way. As far as the kind of other aspects of copyright, usually wherever the work is created, will influence the copyright in one way or another, but usually it's how the work is being used. So say, for example, if somebody in the US was using a research work produced here in Australia, it's actually the US jurisdiction that controls how that material is going to be used by the end user. So they have access to fair use, for example, over there. Here in Australia, say, for example, we take a US researcher's work and reuse it here, we're working in different legislation. We have, say, again, just to use the fair use thing, we don't have fair use, we have fair dealing. So we're working under a kind of different set of goalposts when it comes to copyright. So yeah, usually it's the end user that controls it. But like I said, when it comes to the actual publication of the research output, it can also be influenced by the country that it originates in.
Yeah, thank you very much, first of all, for the talk today. I wanted to ask, what happens to the data if a visitor collects it here and do a publication here, but the visitor wants to use the data back home in home university, or maybe in a PhD thesis? What would happen?
Oh, that's okay. So the data is actually part of your scholarly output. So again, unless the university has directly funded that data, and if they have done that, they will have made you sign an agreement which will spell out that they own it or co-own it or whatever. But if it's just data that you're collecting as part of your general research activities, you and your co-authors would actually control and own that data.
Okay.
So if you want to take it and you know, use it somewhere else, you're more than happy to. If you take that data and make it open data by putting it into the repository, you can also make it available for other researchers to do the same.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
No worries. Okie dokie. All right, well, we'll sign off now. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.